Hi, this is Kate McKinnon with Contemporary Geometric Beadwork. Won't you join us to make an exploding podcast set? We're starting with a 24-point podcast bead, so the first step is to put 24 size 8 round beads in a circle. Go through the circle several times to reinforce it. Tie a knot if you like. Use a long thread, at least a meter, and you can finish this entire first step with one thread. To begin, square stitch 2 beads to each round bead in your circle. We use Delica size 11 beads in alternating colors. After you complete this round of square stitches, your edge count will now be 48 beads instead of the 24 that you started the circle with. Notice that the square stitch is most convenient to do if after you place your set of 2 beads, you pass through 2 beads instead of 1. This places you in position for the next stitch. Pull your beads snug and be sure that they stay sorted out, one color on one side and the other color on the other. It's easiest if you keep them sorted like this from the very first placement. Continue around the ring until every bead has 2 beads placed, and then push your needle through the center round beads to bury the thread a little bit. When you've secured your thread, emerge through one of the round beads and in the middle of one of your sets of square stitch beads. This will put you in typical place for what we call a splitter increase, the sort of increase where you come up between a set of beads to add new beads. In this case, we'll be adding 2 beads in between every 2 bead set, and that's the classic herringbone or triangle increase. In the next round, which is the start of round 3, we're going to be placing 2 increased beads on each point or peak with 1 peyote bead in between. The peyote beads will all be in orange. Now we'll pick up a blue increase, 2 beads, a splitter increase, note, it's going in between the existing 2 beads, and then another single peyote bead, which will in this case be an orange bead, and that orange bead will be placed in between the blue increase and the yellow increase. Interestingly, this is really no different than building a flat peyote triangle. It's just that it has many sides and they're all sticking out into the air like little legs. The goal here is to separate the alternating increases with the peyote stitches so that they do go up and down. Go around the entire ring, placing 2 increases on each point and 1 peyote stitched bead in between each increase. At this point, the podcast bead will have taken on a life of its own. Be careful not to get your thread caught around any of the other beads. If it doesn't look right, it isn't right, and it's much easier to catch problems with your thread when they happen. So take a look after every stitch and make sure your growing podcast looks just like this. At the end of this third round, our bead count will be 3 beads per side. 3 times 24, 72 beads is our edge count now. Here's the completion of round 3, when the last peyote beads are added, and then we'll step up and repeat the round. Only this time there will be 2 peyote beads per side instead of 1, as each of the orange beads that we've added will support a bead on either side of it. This will raise your working bead count to 4 beads per side. You can see how quickly these forms can grow with 2 increases like this. Don't worry too much if you can't get the herringbone increase beads sorted out perfectly right when they're placed. Just be sure that after you've taken your next stitch, which right here you can see is our step up to the next round, after you've taken your stitch, that's the opportunity to, with a little bit of help from the tension, get those beads sorted out. Always check your round before you start a new one. If it doesn't look right, it isn't. So, ready for the beginning of round 4, after which there will be 4 beads per side. This will be a repeat of this round 3, except that there will be 2 orange peyote beads placed instead of just the 1. So right here, we'll place a 2 bead increase, and again that increase is a splitter. It goes in between the previous 2 increase beads. And now here we'll pick up 2 peyote beads passing through the center bead. This is regular peyote with herringbone increase. And the first of our regular peyote beads goes in. Here comes the second. In between the previous increase bead and the peyote bead placed last round. And so they just stack up like this. And now it's time for another increase in the opposing color. And then another 2 peyote beads can be placed one by one. So this is regular peyote with herringbone increases. Continue on through this entire 4th round, placing increases on every point and peyote beads in between them. And after this round is done, we'll have 4 beads per side, and we'll be ready for the 5th and final round of the 24-point podcast. And that round will be just like this one, except we'll be using red beads for the increase points, and there will be 3 peyote stitch beads per side. Here are the completing stitches of round 4, and as you can see, the podcast bead is already structurally very strong and springy. Pull these stitches snug for the springiest possible podcast. This isn't something that you want to be very loose. You want it to be snug with no loose thread whatever. In this 5th and final round of the podcast bead, we put red increase beads on each tip, and now there will be 3 peyote stitch beads in between each increase for a total of 5 beads per side. 5 beads times 24 sides is 120 beads, so you can see how quickly these edges grow. That's a higher count than most people need for a round bangle start, and we're well into rickrack territory now. We'll continue to add beads around this final round, and then when you finish this round, it's nice to reinforce the edge of the podcast a bit. You don't need to pass through the entire bead when this round is done, but it's a good idea to at least go through a few legs of it. This is going to be a tool that you'll use for deconstruction again and again, and so reinforce it as much as you like. Sometimes I go through the whole thing, sometimes just through 2 or 3 legs. Use your judgment, and if your podcast is at all loose, definitely pass through as much of it as you can, because you'll appreciate it more if it's a springy form. After you step up with the last placement, weave in your thread to your taste, bury it in the center ring, and trim it. The next section will be the first of our explosions, and it's called the wave. We're going to start it with a stop bead, and then its round is exactly like the last round of the podcast beads. 2 increases on each point with peyote in between. As we finish the first round of the wave and step up in this last stitch, this should be the last time your needle passes through any of the beads from the 24-point podcast. This is it. Don't go back through those beads again. The thread that you just used to put on this first round of the wave will no longer exist after deconstruction. And so from here on, here comes the start of round 2 of the wave, which I did in blue. From here on, there will be no passing back through previous rounds, so you need to be sure that you have enough thread to do at least these first 2 rounds before you need to change. So start this wave with, over 1 meter of thread. We'll cover you for 2 rounds. Now, to do this second section, we're using what is known as the hexagon increase, and it is a cycle that normally goes what I call 2-1-1, increase, and then a splitter point bead, and then a regular peyote round. But because this podcast is a special circumstance, we're able to actually stack 2 increase rounds on top of each other, knowing that the first round we put on will spread out after deconstruction and become that peyote round. So that gives us the freedom to use a 2-2-1 cycle for this starter, and it makes it just a little bit easier to do the deconstruction because it's easier to get our scissors tips in between 2 increase rounds. If you built this one 2-1-1, that doesn't matter. That works just fine too. So we're starting the wave with 2 rounds of increase, and now here comes a single point round, which I did in gold again. And this is a splitter. It puts 1 bead in between the herringbone increases, but has the effect of being basically just another ordinary peyote round. It's just that those peak beads, those point beads, go in a little bit differently since they're splitters. We've always called this a point round, and we're working on our terminology right now to nail down these terms. You can see that the side bead count now is a little hard to determine because we're no longer on an increase round. This is just a single running line. So it's time now for what we always call the fill round, but this will mirror the first round that went on. It's 2 beads around a point. And so you'll go around the entire round here, the third round of the wave, and just place regular peyote stitch. After that, it'll be time for another increase. And as you do this hexagon increase, you'll see that instead of going straight up and down, the increase stacks will start to knuckle forward. Now it's time for another increase round. And this is where you'll see the effect of knuckling forward. Look at that springy bead. Isn't it wonderful? These make fantastic design elements too. To just make a chain of these is fantastic. But wait till you see what we can make with the wave once this comes off. Talk about chain links. Now, this is regular peyote with increases at each peak. So right here, we'll pick up 2 beads and pass through to the other bead placed in the previous round. See how that increase will sit forward now? If we kept this increase up, the podcast would eventually just grow out over itself, forming a soft wave. So complete this round with increases on every peak and peyote stitch in between. Now it's time for the 6th and final round of the wave. This will be another splitter. Well, we're going to put a gold bead in between, a single bead in between the 2 increased beads at the point. And this is the final of the 6th round. So when this round is complete, with a single bead on every point and plain peyote stitch in between, you'll weave in your thread securely and go through a bit of the edge just to make sure there are no problems when you deconstruct. After you've woven in this thread and ended it and removed your working tail, then we'll be able to add section 3, the spine. Instead of a stop bead, I start the spine with a little loop of beads, and I keep this loop on through the whole creation. And when I get to the other end, which is what you've seen here, the other end of the first round, I use another loop to finish. This way I can just turn around. So this is just plain peyote, and this blue and white alternating 2 and 2 pattern was the very first round I put on with a loop on either end. Now for the second round of the spine, I put on gold, and then for the third round, I'm alternating red and orange. As I get to each end, I simply pass back through the loop to turn around. After I've completed these 3 rounds of plain peyote, I'll be able to deconstruct the spine. Note that the second round I put on will be my core. And the blue and white bead and the orange and red beads will be 2 of my working lines. Before the spine is finished, it needs a stitch in the ditch round that goes along the core, but that's best done after it's taken off of the wave. So our first deconstruction won't be to remove the spine, although it would be easy to do right now. Instead, the first deconstruction will be to remove the wave from the podcast bead. Before you take it apart though, take a minute to enjoy the unusual springiness of this bead. You can see that now that I've trimmed this starting thread on the spine, I had a little tail on there when I started, it's already starting to come off. This is so easy to remove, you won't believe it. But first, right now, let's focus on removing the wave. We're going to cut between the first beads of the new section. And this is why we finished the podcast with red beads, so we know exactly where to put our scissors. Now, if you're using Fireline, you're going to need a special cutter. I built this with Nymo, and it's just like regular thread, so one snip with this little scissors tip will do it. If you're using something else, you're going to need a different kind of snip. See there? The beads, the gold beads there? There's only one thread between them, and my scissors tips fit exactly in there. Push them through, one little snip, snip, and the beads will separate cleanly and easily, provided that you've never actually accidentally passed back through into the podcast bead. You can see now why it's so important that you never go through those beads again after you place your first round. Now, no beads will fall off, or no beads should fall off. But if you do have an accident during deconstruction, don't worry, you'll only lose a few beads, and they're very easy to sew back on. Anyway, these deconstructed edges only have the one thread going through them after this rather than the 2 that every finished edge should have. So you'd never really take one of these apart without attending to that deconstructed edge anyway. Feel free to snip as you go, but you shouldn't actually have to cut between the increases once you've got going. Just gently wiggle it apart. If you ever come to a part that's a little sticky, just perhaps move to the other side and then come back to that one later. Already you can see what a large edge this is going to be. And the little snips of thread come out cleanly, leaving a sturdy peyote stitched wave behind. Once the wave comes off of the pod, then we'll put in the stitch in the ditch round to secure the spine. So let's go ahead and get the rest of this off of the podcast bead. And you should never have to pull hard, but remember, sometimes thread is sticky, so rather than tugging, just take a little snip. You're not going to damage anything in your piece unless you made a mistake and traveled between sections. And as I said, even that is very easy to fix. And once you've made one of these exploding sets, I think you really get the drill, and you're unlikely to pass back through one of those sections again once you've taken one apart. That's all there is to it. And you see there's a little play in that bead edge, but that's only because the beads are opening up from an increase to a fill round. And now we're having a look at a close-up of the wave with the spine on it, and you can see that start of the spine has come undone just a little more, which is just what we like, except we're not quite ready to take it off yet because it's a little more difficult to put the stitch in a ditch in a long string of 3 rounds of peyote. It's wiggly, it turns, and what you want is your stitch in the ditch to be very regular and in a straight line. So you'll rapidly appreciate how nice it is to have the beads fixed to the wave to do this job. If you start the spine from a regular peyote start, then you'll have to manage it in your hands as you go. And as I finish up here with this little wiggly bit, I'll have an opportunity to enjoy again the stability of the wave. And if you see those tiny little cut threads near the ends of my loops, remember that the first thread that went through the piece was cut away, so you'll see just a little bit of fluff left inside the loop, and that represents a thread that no longer exists. You can just trim those fluffy edges, or you can start the spine with stop beads and then begin the loop in the second round. Whatever you do though, on your way out, reinforce the loop, go all the way around, and then bury your thread well down in the beads. This is a working spine, and you'll want to be sure that it's well reinforced before you take it off. If you have to trim a thread to get your spine off, it should be very easy to see. As you peel back the beads, either it'll just come away cleanly, or you'll see which thread it is you need to snip. So get the spine going, and then snip as necessary to release that thread, and your spine should peel cleanly away from the edge of your wave. As I say, if you have a problem here, it's probably just because you accidentally passed from one section to another while you were working. Many of us have a habit of reinforcing, and that can be a hard habit to break. In the exploding set, you're welcome to reinforce all you like, but you need to stay in your section. It's like at the concerts. You don't get to go up to section A if you are in section C, although who among us hasn't tried it at least once? And there we go. It's almost off. Perfect. Now it's just a matter of cleaning up all the little loose threads, and they come right out. And then there you have it, 3 finished pieces. Podcast bead, ready to rock, a casting spine, and a geometric wave. I'm going to show you wonderful things to do with each of those pieces over the next week.